Richard Pullman.
Okay, so I'm Richard Pullman. I'm here with Syntarsus, and he's one of the members of GDG. We got him on just tonight. He wanted to talk about his system and some of the, opinions and issues that we all have with RPGs and design, game design. So we're happy to have him on. Why don't you introduce yourself? Tell us about who you are and the game that you're making.
Hello, good to be here. My name is Syntarsus. I'm a forever GM. I love theory crafting and all that. I am currently developing a system that I call Plug and Play Pokemon, and it is so called because the primary goal of the system is to be able to sort of take the mechanics and the stats and plug them in and just start playing.
Okay. So what made you want to design that particular system? Because there's other tabletop Pokemon games, if I'm correct, and you must have found something lacking in them.
Yeah, the primary problem that I had there were a few common problems that I had, and then there were a few system specific problems. The most prominent tabletop Pokemon system, if you're not familiar with the community,
I'm not.
Is yeah, I don't think most people are. I think I see every now and then, it's like twice a month, somebody will float like, hey, how can I run a Pokemon game or usually it's a Pokemon Mystery Dungeon game. Somebody will float that on TG and it will die in like 20 posts or less. So I think there's interest, but it's sort of one of those things that's been sort of deemed impossible.
Oh yeah.
And, part of that is because of the failure of the Pokemon Tabletop, series. So there's, Pokemon Tabletop Adventures and Pokemon Tabletop United. And if you talk to anybody who's actually played a session of them, they are most notable for being ungodly complex.
Which you wouldn't expect for a kid's game that, Pokemon the video game isn't that complex.
Right, exactly. And so one of the main problems with them is, that complexity, but I think the bigger problem is that in order to play a Pokemon game, you basically need to learn an entirely new system. And that's true for all of the Pokemon games. There isn't really a system where, your intuitions from the games or from the anime are, backed up in the actual, mechanical, components of the system.
Yeah, and the tabletop versions that they make.
Right, yeah.
So I know I've heard recently, I was listening to a guy talk about, his experience porting over games into tabletop, and he was saying that there is a lot of sacrifices you have to make in order to recreate the feeling of the game, and sometimes that's the hard part, is that you sort of have to bend the logic of the system so it's not faithful anymore, but in a sense you recreate some of the experiences you have, and you have to kind of just take a slice out of the game, the video game, in order to make it work on a tabletop. But you're saying that doesn't even work properly because it just becomes bogged down, and I'm imagining if you're saying it's that complex, then it's kind of just intimidating and off-putting to even play the game.
Right. Well, so one of the problems is actually that the people who made Pokemon Tabletop United and to Pokemon Tabletop Adventures tried to keep a lot of the subsystems of the games present in the tabletop game.
Like what kind of subsystems would it be? Because I'm familiar with some of the oldest Pokemon games, and I don't know what they've all added in the more recent generations. But what would be an example of something that you would like, you shouldn't have included this?
So one of the most complex subsystems in the Pokemon games are actually, the way Pokeballs work. So, for example, the way that they work is this long, complex equation with, multi-variable equation. And, a lot of the factors that are included in the calculations in the game, are present in the, Tabletop United. Tabletop United is kind of the more popular one.
Right.
Because it's like a streamlining actually of Tabletop Adventures.
Okay, so like Pokeballs, it's trying to calculate obviously a lot of stuff so that it can't be abused by players, I imagine, and you can kind of have, realistic or true to the game sort of feeling of how hard it is to catch something. I imagine that would be their justification for it. So what would you find is the problem when you're actually playing it in the tabletop version? Yeah,
so when you're catching a Pokemon, it's sort of the culmination, right? So it's the climax of the battle, if you will.
Oh, right, yeah.
Particularly when it's a particularly powerful Pokemon. So if you're trying to capture a legendary Pokemon, for example.
Yeah.
And trying to add all these different factors in makes calculating everything much more difficult, and it slows down the game, right? So you're at the climax. This is when it should be just roll the dice and find out what your result is, right? So
because you're excited and you want to see.
Exactly, yeah. The release of tension, right? So if we think about it narratively, we've had the building action. That was the entire rest of the fight. We've reached the climax, and now it should be falling action. And stopping to calculate all these different factors that play into it bogs things down, and it ruins the climax in a way, because then you start it basically yanks you back into remembering that you're sitting around a table rolling dice, pretending to be dogfighters, right?
Right. And
and honestly, I'm not even really that against including math, because we do, as tabletop gamers, we do a lot of math casually that we just never think about, right? So just to take D&D, for example. In D&D, you roll your dice, and you roll your D20, add whatever that number is to your other modifier, and then calculate that and compare it to AC. So that's like, 3 different steps?
Yeah.
Right? But it's sort of streamlined enough and convenient enough that we don't really think about it as gamers. It's just something that we it becomes our way of interacting with the game universe, if you like.
Yeah, and it's consistent enough that you just adapt to it and integrate it.
Right, exactly. So the actual numbers that change from the variable numbers are not really that common or that variable. So, it's like a number between 1 and 30, right?
Right. Yeah.
Or, even calculating damage. Like in D&D, calculating damage can be adding up to 6 or 8 numbers together to find out how badly you hurt the thing. But it's convenient enough and fast enough that we integrate it into our understanding of the game universe.
Yeah, personally, I don't like rolling that many dice for damage, and I have a lot of problems with the basic way that D&D works. But I do totally appreciate that you can get used to it, and then it's just part of the excitement of getting to roll a bunch of dice and it feeling like, obviously you're hoping for that big number, you add it together, and it doesn't take a long time as long as you're not terrible at math.
Right. And even if you are terrible at math, everybody has a calculator on their phone.
That's true. And so,
yeah.
What your point is with the Pokemon system that wasn't working properly is that there was already a feeling in the game that obviously justified, the game is extremely popular, and obviously people love that climax of catching something, and yet when the system sort of fails to capture that feeling, it betrays all the expectations that you would have as a player going into it.
Exactly. Yeah. And, one of the other things that, is a problem is, and it's one of the things that you don't even think about. So for example, if you had 6 monsters on your belt that you could breathe fire and shoot poison and, create electric lightning strikes and all the rest of that stuff. Mm-hmm. And, suddenly you were attacked and, by a wild Pokemon. In the games, you're limited to one Pokemon, right? But otherwise, in, Pokemon Tabletop United, one of the things they explicitly allow is you can use as many Pokemon as you like.
What? That's bizarre.
Yeah, and exactly. And it's one of the things it's one of the other problems with the games is that now you are having to use, you're having to basically handle up to 7 character sheets in a battle.
That's crazy.
Yeah, exactly. And so the rules explicitly say that you can do that.
Is there any,
it's one of those things, sorry?
Is there any, benefit to only having one out, or is it pretty much you're stupid if you're not using all of them?
There might be some modifiers. I can't remember offhand if there are any drawbacks to having all your Pokemon out. But one of the things that so when I set about making my system, one of the rules I explicitly set was that you can only have one Pokemon out. And so one of the aspects of Pokemon is that it's quick, right? So when there's a type advantage or a type disadvantage, you feel that right away.
Yeah, for sure.
Right? As long as the Pokemon are on par level-wise. And so that's one of the other things I wanted to sort of capture in my system. And based off the playtest I've done, I feel like I did a pretty good job of that. But to get back to what we were talking about, I went on a tangent there. It's one of those things that actually, if you don't think about it, it doesn't make sense. But even if you think about it in the context of the game, first, imagine if you went out and captured 6 4-year-olds and, put them in a cage match, right?
Yeah.
You were able to direct each of them in combat. It would be chaos. So it's one of those things that, in certain ways, like you said at the beginning, breaking rules of the system to create breaking rules of the games to create the feel of the games, is one of the things that's really important when you're translating across mediums.
Right.
But what I've found is that a lot of the times keeping limitations from the games is just as important. Because if you start removing limitations, then it can suddenly become a totally different game.
Yeah, personally for me, it doesn't make any sense in the video games why you couldn't throw out multiple Pokeballs and release your dudes and send them all out, but who cares? That's the strategic element of the game. It's a rock, paper, scissors sort of format, so you have to be careful who you have out. And you could make an argument that it doesn't make for a manageable fight if you have multiple Pokemon out on your side, this kind of stuff. So I'm very surprised to hear that they actually did that. And I agree that the limitations, they're there for a reason. There's a reason why they don't allow you to have a bunch out in the video games. And so you said that this was a plug and play. What kind of, how do you structure it so that there's elements that you can essentially ignore if you don't want to put them in the game?
How are you asking about modularity?
Yeah, I imagine from what you said about being a plug and play system that because that's actually one of the things that a recent guest on the show talked about was the idea of having a sort of universal system that can handle a lot of things, but you don't have to use all of the subsystems. You can kind of pick and choose the tools that you want to use from that. So do you have this sort of similar philosophy in designing it, that you want to have modularity and optional components?
In a sense, what I really tried to do was I tried to boil down into the base components and say, all right, what do we absolutely need in a Pokemon game to make it feel like Pokemon, right? And so, to me at least, one of the things that, one of the appeals to me that I mentioned earlier, I'm a forever GM, mm-hmm. and one of the things that appeals to me about running a Pokemon game is essentially, you have an 800 monster bestiary, at your fingertips when you set something in the Pokemon universe, right?
Yeah.
So it's, very, and it's one of the things in the official Pokemon media, there's a lot of, space that hasn't been, storytelling space that hasn't been explored yet. So I think that it makes sense to me that people keep wanting to come back to this setting, because there's a lot of opportunity there to sort of explore and create new stories.
Yeah,
so
for sure.
One of the things that I really wanted to do was to be able to have versatility as far as the creatures that you can encounter and the different beasts and, the different Pokemon that you can encounter, and still maintain their unique feel while keeping the system playable, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because having to look up a bunch of stuff that you don't necessarily, or essentially having to learn a brand new system is always intimidating, and having to look a bunch of stuff up in that system and having to have like 3 different PDFs for all of the, like one for the rules, one for the Dungeon Master, one for the monsters. D&D can get away with that, but, I think that that's a little bit annoying because I personally don't like PDFs that much.
Yeah, I totally agree.
So, essentially what I've been doing is I, have been looking for ways to translate the, stats of the games into a tabletop format. So, each of the 6 stats, you can basically take a Pokemon from the games and use their stats in the game.
Oh, I see.
And so you plug the stats in and then you can start playing.
There's sort of a direct conversion that works.
Right, exactly. I think that I've done a pretty good job with that.
And that's why you call it plug and play, is because you can actually convert things very easily from the video games into the system.
Right, exactly.
Oh, okay. I was misunderstanding. I thought you meant there's whole sections and subsystems of the tabletop game that are optional, but that makes perfect sense. You're familiar with the games. You could even then presumably, recreate specific team, setups with your different Pokemon.
Yeah. And that's kind of one of the major goals, is like to be able to take everybody I think has had the experience of when they're playing the games going, oh, wouldn't it be cool if I could, why do I have to teach one of my Pokemon cut? Wouldn't it be cool if I could do this or that? And so, this system kind of allows you to do that in the context of a tabletop game.
That makes perfect sense. You said that you've play tested it. Where would you say the game is in terms of completion?
The thing that I was the most worried about was the combat system. And I've tested that fairly, I think that that's, very good. I actually posted a PDF of that a while back in the, GDG Discord server.
Right.
And I'm actually working on a second draft of that right now. Most of the rules as far as non-combat things go actually didn't make it into that draft, just because I've been focusing on getting the combat playable for so long. So if you want, I could talk about sort of what the central mechanic is.
Yeah, I'd love to hear it.
Excuse me. So essentially what I'm working with is, it's a sort of percentile roll under system.
Right.
So you have a percentage chance of doing something and then you roll against, and so that works for both Pokemon and people. So when you can take the moves from the game, you look them up on, Bulbapedia or whatever thing it is, and then you write them down on your character sheet. And so when you want to use a move, you roll against the accuracy of that move.
Like the official accuracy that's coded in the games?
Right, exactly. Because this is actually one of the things that was quite easy, is that all have an accuracy rating, the percent that they'll hit. So you just roll against that. And then, since it's a tabletop game, there are various modifiers that affect how likely you are to hit. So one of the things that I did I'll come back to combat and movement in a second. But, basically depending on your placement, it can, different factors in combat can affect that. So apply penalties and, bonuses to your accuracy score for a move.
That sounds like a really smart way of constructing the whole thing, because the more you're essentially cheating by importing all the data, the hard rules and data from the existing games, and not only does that spare you the work of having to do it all yourself, but it allows people to use their existing knowledge and expertise from the system and the games in the tabletop, and it should work the same way.
Right, exactly. And that was exactly what the intention was. And so players basically, I split up. I can talk about character creation, as well, but basically players have different skills. And so those skills, act as modifiers to whatever to their roles. So anytime a player character wants to do a check, they roll against one of their skills, and then, based off, the DC that the DM provides, they succeed or fail at that.
Okay, so in that sense, it's pretty standard.
Yeah.
Which is good, because it means more people who are familiar with just, D&D and typical RPG setup will be able to get into it more easily too, because for myself, I'm not that familiar with Pokemon, but I know how these other systems work. I could start playing it, and it wouldn't take me that much to, get the basics of how that game works.
Right, exactly. One of the, and so like what you said, it's fairly similar to D&D in a lot of respects. And so my group, primarily plays Pathfinder, much to my chagrin. And so they were able to pick it up very easily.
So, but you didn't quite answer how far you said, you are to completion. Would you say that you're done the first draft, you're working on the second draft, and assuming that that's good enough, then... Yeah,
the primary thing that I'm working on adding in the second draft is, sort of advice for role-playing and character creation, creating campaigns, things like that.
Okay, yeah.
So I'm working on fleshing out the actual, tabletop aspect of it.
Well, one of the things I wanted to get into with you is if you say that you're the forever GM, one of the things I find very interesting is somebody who doesn't GM much, and I'm always happy to talk to people who GM a lot and get insight from them on how to make a system work and how to maximize different parts of it and that kind of stuff. But I imagine as a game designer, you're approaching it from a very different perspective than a player might if you're designing a system, because you have to have a lot in mind already of, conveniences and systems that you as the forever GM would like to see.
Yeah, I think that, one of the things that a lot of people who are players and then transition over to GMing, have trouble with is the idea of basically encouraging character growth. Because, a player is sort of the master of their own character. So whatever they want their character to do happens, right? As long as it doesn't interfere with the GM's domain. And then the GM is the master of the world. So the GM's domain stops where the player character's free will begins, is kind of the traditional view of that. Mm-hmm. But I think one of the things that's really, underrated and not really talked about in a lot of sort of introductory, GM texts, say, just to use Pathfinder as an example again, is how to encourage character growth, and basically how to communicate how you want your players to grow their characters.
And
I know that that's a skill that it took me a long time to develop.
So you're going to put in advice into your system, presumably that covers that same thing of constructing campaigns and story arcs and sort of incentives for people to grow their characters. Yeah,
exactly. And so I'll kind of to give a preview of what that will look like. One of the things that I always try to make sure I do this with sort of campaigns that are intended to be very short is make sure that they have a character goal, and not just a sort of something vague, but something personal to that character. So the three characteristics that I like to see in a character goal are: it should be personal, it should be specific and attainable, and it should be not disruptive. Oh, yeah. So what do I mean by that? I think a lot of people kind of understand what I mean by those things, but to sort of give an example to people who might not. One of the things that I actually found quite interesting when I started thinking about it is that the three sort of goals that the Pokemon games and media give the player are actually terrible character goals for tabletop characters.
You mean gotta catch 'em all?
Well, so there are three that I've identified. So gotta catch 'em all, being the very best, and in the games at least, beating Team Rocket.
Oh, right, yeah.
Yeah, so each of those is kind of bad for different reasons. They all share some reasons. So I'll take being the very best first. So being the very best is a bad character goal because it's not specific, and it's not really personal either. It's there are a million people out in the Pokemon world who would like to be the Pokemon master, but they don't quit their day jobs, so to speak, right?
Yeah, it's kind of a generic ideal that anybody could have.
Right, exactly. And so, I think that's a great way of putting it, is generic ideals are not character goals, right? So a character goal is something that is specific to that person. So it's something that that person wants to achieve.
Like a Charmander killed my parents, and now I want to go and kill all the Charmanders.
Well, so that kind of runs into one of the other ones, is it should be attainable, right? Or,
Right.
I'm sorry, it actually runs into both of them, because that would also be really disruptive.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because then you're chasing down every Charmander. That could actually work with a legendary Pokemon, because there's a limited number of them. So the GM could potentially include them in the campaign.
Yeah.
Right? So, getting vengeance on a specific, individual, I think is a great character goal, because then all the GM has to do is include, clues or a trail every now and then.
The breadcrumb trail
that pays off. Sorry?
The breadcrumb trail that, your character will endlessly pursue, even to the, to the ends of the earth, just because, that was their goal, and it becomes more meaningful the more you torture them with it.
Right, exactly. And I think that a lot of players who, I think that a lot of players who, haven't really played who haven't played with GMs who do that kind of stuff, don't realize how sort of emotionally invested.
Right. I mean, there is that old school mentality of role playing being go in, slay the dragon, get the gold, and get out, and it's sort of just an operation. It's not really, there's nothing personal about it. And that can be satisfying just as a competitive challenge that you're trying to do. And your character can take a lot of personal pride in how effective they are, that kind of stuff. But that is very different than the, what most people would probably call the role-playing, side of it, where you invest emotionally and have hooks in your background and in your personal life that are only relevant to your character.
Yeah, I agree with that. And you kind of brought up old school games. I actually think that old school games do a fantastic job of promoting that. And so that's kind of why we see the OSR, old school renaissance, going on, is because old school games tend to be sort of light enough in terms of mechanical complexity that players don't, they're able to keep their eye on the role-playing ball. So
Interesting. I hadn't thought about it that way. Yeah, because the system can become an obstacle to that kind of stuff if everything is codified into mechanics and you're too busy juggling those.
Yeah, totally agree. And it's the problem. I don't think it's necessarily a problem intrinsically. I think it becomes a problem though when the mechanics become an ends in themselves, right? So I want my character's goal is to get 10 million gold because that's how much it takes to reach level 20. That's a shitty goal.
Oh, right. Yeah, that's like a mechanical goal that your character in the world, if you were actually that person, wouldn't even think about, or it wouldn't make any sense for that to be the goal.
Right.
Does that tie in with your feelings on complexity?
So I'm actually I think complexity gets in a way it does. I think complexity actually gets a bad rap a lot of times. Cause there's sort of this focus on rules light. And I know I was just praising old school games for being rules light. But I think that it kind of can go, a little too far in that direction. Because I think that there's actually a lot of utility to games that have a fair amount of mechanical complexity.
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, in my mind, there's a zone of complexity that you want to stay within, and it's enough to give people answers for, tricky questions. As a GM especially, you gotta have something you can point to or look at to resolve a situation, but at the same time, you don't want to be a slave to this huge text of rules and tables and things that you can't really adapt and without sort of breaking the system, and somebody can then be a rules lawyer and try to argue about it. I think there has to be a middle ground there. Right,
exactly. I don't know if it's necessarily a middle ground. I think part of it comes down to how the text is written. Because the way that I've said this before is that a good system tells you how to do things. A bad system tells you what you can do.
Yeah. I was just talking to Tom Jensen, who's sort of a new guy on the GDG Discord there, and he pointed me to some old war game books written by a guy named Don Featherstone, who's one of the sort of godfathers of tabletop wargaming. And one of the biggest selling points of that guy's systems was they basically instructed you on how to think about everything, as opposed to telling you the specific procedures for things.
Yeah, I would agree that that's, it's kind of weird because usually we, at least I have a kind of, when I hear somebody say that something is telling me or somebody is telling me how to think, I usually kind of have a negative reaction to that, but that's kind of how you have to design a game. There should be a sort of internal logic to the system, and everything in the system, all the rules, should be pointing to that internal logic.
I know go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I mean, in my system, I started out with a hopelessly complex ambition of having discrete and very specific rules for how everything was going to work, because I thought that meant it was a better system. And over time, it's definitely been one revelation after another that you just have to let go of that. And it's so much better to have a guideline in some situations than a hard and fast rule or set of procedures you have to do. And then that's the beauty of not designing a video game and designing a tabletop game where humans interpret it, and actually you can tell them how they're supposed to interpret the rules. And it's like, if they're not obeying the rules, then they're not playing the game.
Yeah, I agree. So can we talk a little bit about some of the benefits of mechanical complexity? Because I do think that there are quite a few.
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead. I mean, I like the idea of a very robust, deep system that is very sure of itself and has answers for everything. In terms of personally running that kind of game and forcing the players to learn it and stuff, I see the hurdles and obstacles to it as well. So there's definitely a trade-off, I would think.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think one of the benefits of a mechanically complex system is that it creates sort of little, it creates little asymmetries. And so I'm using, kind of the physics definition of asymmetry. If basically the idea is that any way that you can compare something, so for instance, usually we think of a geometric, right? So a circle is symmetrical because any way that you cut it, if you cut it in half, any direction, it will be the same.
Right.
But with a square, there's only, actually a square is a bad example. Triangle is a better example. So if you, cut an isosceles triangle in certain ways, then it won't be symmetrical.
Right.
Right. So an asymmetry is just something that differs in a given direction. And I think that that's kind of what creates the texture of a world that feels real. Because in real life, everything is, even if two things are theoretically, the same, they all have their own unique differences, right? So all humans are they're in the same category, but we all have our differences. And I think that the benefit of, to me at least, the benefit of mechanically complex systems is particularly pronounced in character creation, right? So games that have a lot of options in character creation, as long as those options are equally valid, then I think that that's a great way of making a world feel, the game world at least, feel real. Because, everybody has kind of their own way of doing it. And, that's kind of the thing that I think a lot of old school games have trouble with, is that every fighter basically does the same thing.
Oh, right, yeah. I see what you mean.
Right? So to kind of make this a little less abstract, I mentioned before we started recording, that GURPS is my favorite system.
You weren't joking about that, right?
No, I actually was not. And it gets a bad rap for a lot of these things, but, I think that, I think that a lot of that is undeserved. And one of the benefits is exactly what I was talking about, is that, because it's balanced against, reality, to a certain extent, anything that your character does feels different from something else that a different character does, right? So shooting, one of the writers for GURPS actually uses this as an example. Shooting a gun feels different from, shooting a lightning bolt or, shooting a crossbow, because they all have different effects and, different, sort of mechanical underpinnings.
Oh, right, because the system is complex enough to make those distinctions mechanically. Then
exactly.
The whole world becomes more textured and more, forces you in a way on a role-playing level, forces you to consider differently and invest attention into your surroundings differently when you know that guy has a gun and that guy has a crossbow and those two things are different, for example.
Exactly. Yep.
Now, I think the opposite of that, maybe I'm getting this mixed up, but I'm pretty sure I was reading recently the Savage Worlds book, and it was like the exact opposite was true. The whole goal of that system was to make things indistinguishable, and there's actually just a certain handful of spells or rules or powers, as I think they call them, and it specifically says that it's interchangeable to have like the defense spell. If you're playing in a sci-fi setting, you go ahead and flavor it however you want. It's an electrical defense matrix that comes up and protects you, or in an ancient fantasy setting, it's a magic bubble that, protects you, and they specifically advertise it as being mechanically exactly the same, but your character and your setting is responsible for flavoring it in a way that makes it unique.
Yeah, that's actually a pretty common approach, I find. Personally, I've not played Savage Worlds. I would like to, because I've heard very good things about it. I am familiar with, one game that kind of does something similar that I'm a little more familiar with is Fate.
Oh yeah. I've heard about Fate. I've never looked into it.
Yeah, it kind of does something very similar. Another, something that kind of does, well, I was gonna say, the White Wolf games, Mage the Ascension,
okay.
Mage the Awakening. But they're doing something a little bit different, I think, now that I'm thinking about it.
But the point would be with something like Savage Worlds, the reason why they would advertise that is because obviously you can suddenly make it simpler for kids who want to play, or somebody who doesn't want to memorize or can't memorize enough to handle the complexity of a more complex system, which is why I find it a little bit interesting that in a Pokemon system, if I'm assuming that you're applying a complex system to that.
So here's sort of my litmus test for, mechanical complexity. So I think mechanical complexity is actually fine, but the really big, but I don't like referring to charts in the middle of combat either. I hate that as much as the next guy. So my litmus test is whether it can reasonably be written down on it. So you don't necessarily have to memorize the chart. You just have to memorize the part that you just have to write down the part that applies to your character and memorize that. And I think that that's sort of I think that that's really, honestly, the best way to handle that. And it's a way of implementing mechanical complexity while still keeping your game playable.
Yeah, if I think about, from what I understand about Pathfinder and, what I've read about GURPS, it's a very broad amount of selection, but in the end, you don't have to learn a lot of entirely different systems. So it is more about which of those many options. Unless you're the GM.
Yeah.
Well, how does that change? Because I've never done GMing that much. So,
that was kind of a joke, but basically, if you're the GM, your job changes a little bit because so in GURPS, one of the things compared to D&D 5th edition, you can basically hand a player the book, leave them alone for 30 minutes and come back, take their character sheet and be ready to roll. You can't really do that in GURPS because basically you need to know all the parts of the system that relate to all the players' characters.
Right.
And I think that's why a lot of them, a lot of these sort of mechanically complex games, get a bad rap, is because they require a lot of GM investment.
Oh, yes. And then when the GM, is frustrated with the system or feels like they're overwhelmed, they don't want to do that much work. Obviously, a lot of people, the GM is the one that recruits people into the session, so you'll have a bad rap right off the hop with basically the core people that are going to evangelize your system.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a legitimate problem. And it's one of those things, I think that Pathfinder kind of gets around this a little. I actually dislike Pathfinder, go figure. But I think one of the ways it gets around this is it has a ton of published material. And I think that's why, so basically it kind of goes back to, you only have to memorize what's written down, right? So in Pathfinder, they actually have material that's written down for the GM. And that's what, in the form of modules and bestiaries and all the rest of that. GURPS doesn't really have that kind of support, and I think that's why it's not played as much as it should be.
Interesting.
So to kind of bring it back to the Pokemon system, I actually tried to avoid mechanical complexity as I could. The main problem that I'm having, I actually don't think that I have that much mechanical complexity. I know we just spent a fair amount of time talking about that in GURPS. So because the main thing I focused on with that was playability. So if you want to, I could go into character creation a little bit.
Yeah, let's talk about that a little bit.
Okay, so essentially to make your trainer, all the trainers have the same stats as the Pokemon. So trainers have HP, attack, defense, special attack, special defense, speed.
Okay.
And so that's just a way to make it easier to, because at some point somebody's going to want to kick a Rattata or whatever.
Exactly. Yeah.
And then you have to have a way of resolving that. You also have 7 skills. We talked about skills a little bit more, a little bit at the top, excuse me. And so those skills, I based them off of the different types of trainers that you encounter in the game. So the skills are, it's not super important, but it's art, athletics, occult, social, science, Pokemon, and was that 7?
I wasn't counting, but
yeah, things along those lines. Oh, and survival is the 7th one. So basically they kind of epitomize the different archetypes that you have of different trainers that you meet throughout the game.
Yeah, I like the sound of that already.
Yeah, so it's fairly simple. And so then you put points into it, and basically every time you put a point into a skill, you have to pick a specialty within that skill. So say that you put a point in to your Pokemon skill. You then pick a specialty, so you might say, I want to specialize in electric. So you say, okay. And then your skill, you get a +5. Well, it would be a -5 roll, because you're trying to roll under.
Right.
So -5 to whatever you roll. And so then when you roll within your specialty, you get an additional -5 for each point that you have in that specialty. So if you have 1 point in Pokemon and that point is an electric Pokemon, you get a -5 anytime you roll against, to know something about Pokemon or to handle a Pokemon or anything like that. But then when you deal with electric Pokemon, you get a -10.
Interesting. I'm trying to think of, that's not too different from how I wanted to handle specialization of skills in my own system, but that's a pretty decent system. And then with this, how much of this would be like right up front in character creation, and how much of it evolves over time?
So, the way that I'm handling that right now is you get 10 points. So players have levels, just like their Pokemon. The main difference is that players level based off of their Pokemon. So, what I have right now, and this is part of what I'm trying to see in playtesting, is how it evolves over the course of a campaign, is for every 5 levels that a Pokemon that you own gains, gained amongst any Pokemon that you own, I should say, you gain a level. So you start with 10 character points, and those can be used to raise either your skills or your attributes. So you can, if you want to, you can put them into speed or attack, kind of like the martial artists.
Right.
Right. So train alongside your Pokemon if you like. And so your boots or your skills, you get 10 points at the beginning of character creation. So at level 1, you start with 10 points to distribute between those as you see fit. And then every level you get an additional.
That makes sense.
I'm not sure, did that all come across?
Yeah, I get that. I'm thinking of what the next topic is going to be here. We want to talk about some randomness, and I remember you talking about, the character creation in D&D. Sounded like you didn't like the dice rolling, mechanic of generating a character in D&D.
Yeah, we can talk about that a little bit. I kind of have a love-hate relate with rolling for stats, because on the one hand, the thing that I don't like about point buy in a class-based system is that all the characters.
Yeah.
Right. So if you have a bard, he's always going to in charisma.
Yes.
And then 16 in dexterity, and then followed by constitution, strength, and then intelligence or wisdom, depending on whether he wants to focus on,
Right. It's a balancing, there's basically a necessity to min-max in a certain way when you can do point buy.
Right, because, in order to be able to keep up with everybody else, you basically have to do that.
And the argument I've heard people say that, that is the skill of D&D as a game, is how much you can maximize your character and your subclasses and your different traits and feats and stuff that you can pick. They take a direct pride in being able to maximize those things, which is why you have a whole school of thought against that, which is roll everything and you have to take whatever it is. But I don't like that idea either.
Yeah, because the problem with that ends up being, let's say you want to play a bard and then you roll an 8 for your charisma. Well, you're going to be a shit bard now.
Yeah.
You might be an alright fighter, but you wanted to play a bard.
Why would your character even be a bard if he doesn't have any charisma?
Exactly, yeah. And I think that, I'm very sympathetic though to the people who want to roll, because I think that goes back to what we were discussing earlier, that idea of asymmetries in in reality. Right? Because when everybody isn't, in real life, people aren't min-max, right? Like some people,
right.
Some people just have weird stat distributions, and I think part of the necessity of min-maxing comes from, the class system, actually.
Well, absolutely. I'm personally avoiding classes in my own system, and to whatever extent your character becomes specialized, it's a choice you make as you're playing, not something you pick off the bat. And then, if you fail at it, then, your character is permanently useless.
Yeah, I strongly support that, because I think that the sort of dream of getting an easy to play, classless system is, very, very real, because, classless system, the whole tension of roll versus point buy, I think comes from that structure.
Yeah. And that's where something like GURPS, which is, point buy, but a lot of it is limited, based on the GM's decisions of the setting. I appreciate how they tried to set it up. If you read it in sort of the way it's intended, it feels to me like they're advocating a realistic trade-off, and the fact that you take negative traits to offset your positive traits will make your character inherently balanced, supposedly. I haven't tested it out, and I haven't tested it out at all, but in theory, your character becomes very interesting. The more powerful they are, the more they have disadvantages, and then obviously the GM can use all of that to create hooks and challenges that your character won't feel like they're just a min-maxed character, because it's entirely circumstantial whether they're, being far-sighted or nearsighted or something will come into play. It's a flaw they have that can be used in the construction of the campaigns and stories.
Yeah, and that's actually one of my other favorite features of GURPS is that it's like the character, your sort of character personality and how your character is baked into the character creation process.
Yeah,
right?
I appreciate that, because I've seen guys, I know some people who, they have no problem role-playing, but they don't want to really role-play anything if it's not officially what their character is about and it's not recorded somewhere, because they really don't enjoy the sense of improvising a lot. They want to instead have a determined character that they will roleplay it exactly as it is written on the sheet, but anything that's not on the sheet, they're not going to roleplay, basically.
Yeah, and I think that GURPS is actually for getting for a couple, not just this reason. I think there's a few other reasons, but I won't go into those unless we want.
Sorry, what was the topic?
Or on the sheet in black and white.
Oh,
so it's it kind of is a very good. I find that it's really great for teaching new players how to roleplay.
Oh yeah, I can see that, because, and these are newer players that I'm talking about here too. So maybe that's the correlation.
Yeah, because like a lot of people feel kind of goofy, like just like what do I do? Do I just pick a voice? Do I do I have to start dressing a certain way? Like, do I have to gesticulate a certain way?
Or even just stuff like my character in the world, why would I roleplay that he's clumsy and he, banged into something if that's not a disadvantage, that my character has officially? It's like my character, you don't really feel
the
like...
idea of like purposefully gimping your character for the sake of, or gimping your ability to do stuff in the world for the sake of an interesting character. Like, that's a very tricky skill, if it's not sort of baked into the system.
Yeah, because you're not necessarily, I think there's a whole class of players who, they're not really into the escapist power fantasy of role-playing, but at the same time, it feels like it's either that or you go fully into the method acting, doing a funny accent, and, there's like it's hard to get that middle ground again where your character has definitive things they are good and bad at, and even quirks and, sort of oddball characteristics, but you still take the character seriously and you're not just trying to get your friends to laugh or something like that.
Right. Yeah, cause like in the group that I currently play in, at least, if a character has any sort of flaw, it becomes exaggerated and like it becomes disruptive, like like the classic trope of the dumb barbarian who just likes drinking and fighting, and so like anytime something doesn't involve those two things, the player just checks out. Yeah,
they refuse to even cooperate with the logic of the situation because they've got this sort of entertaining ace in the hole that they can pull out any time.
Right, exactly. And so like I think there's also, like, I think you were just talking about, like, there's this idea that, if it's not, my character drinks and he likes drinks fighting, so dealing with situations outside of that, then I don't know how to, it's kind of like an insecurity, like not knowing exactly how to function.
Right. And to me, that's one of the key things about, as a designer, if somebody wants to design a role-playing game, I can't help but empathize with different player types that just literally are uncomfortable at the table because you have to go outside a comfort zone if you want to role play, a vulnerable character who has ambitions and whatever. And chances are that the actual group of humans you're sitting with at the table have never seen you, act vulnerable before, because that's not cool. Why would you do that?
Right, exactly. And I think that kind of gets into what I think is the real strength of tabletop games, which is, it's essentially a structured way for group storytelling.
Right. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah. So I think, we talked a little bit about like the sort of old school, hack and slash, the
dungeon
logistics, dungeon raiding, logistics focused gameplay. And so, I think that that's missing out on a certain, a lot of the strengths of the tabletop method. But at the same time, even that is kind of telling a story, Yeah. Like, Tucker's Kobolds is, legendary for that reason, right?
I don't know what Tucker's Kobolds are offhand.
Oh,
I know I've heard of it.
It's the story of basically this GM. I think somebody posted it on TG years ago, but, essentially, he was back when he was in the military. He and some guys had I think this was a 2nd edition campaign. And so the GM had a multi-floor mega dungeon set up, and the first floor, and the GM's name was Tucker. And so the first floor were these kobolds, and so they were basically they became legendary for being the nastiest fuckers you have ever seen in your life.
Okay, now I do remember this. I've heard somebody explain this before.
Yeah, for anybody who isn't familiar with the story, they had traps set up. They never engaged in direct confrontation. Basically, they were the smartest, dungeon monsters you've ever seen.
Because Tucker was basically, using real knowledge of guerrilla warfare and stuff to...
Exactly, yeah. And so all of these guys were, military guys, so they had to use tactics and, different, and so, eventually it got to the point where there's kind of towards the end of the story, there's this, sort of anecdote about, when they were 9th level or something crazy like that. They were pretty high up there. They'd just gotten through fighting these demons and stealing their stuff. And so they were trying to figure out how to get all the crap that they just looted out. And, they couldn't figure out a way to do it without, going back through the kobolds. And, the story kind of recounts how, the party leader was almost in tears about having to go back and face these kobolds after, fighting off these 9th level demons.
Yeah, the demons are much less scary than this. And I imagine that going back to the point about, role playing being possible even in these old systems is that the way that you handle and present situations is still going to be what creates these emergent stories that aren't scripted ahead of time, but they are memorable and they are worth recounting, obviously, as we now all know about Tucker's Kobolds.
Right, exactly. And so I think that's, having a structure cause, I think that, it's a lot of, I think that's very beneficial in a lot of ways because, so sort of I started talking about this, before I got into Tucker's Kobolds, but the way that I view tabletop gaming is as I think you said it really well, an emergent, structure for telling emergent stories.
Right, yeah.
And so storytelling is one of the things that's fundamental to being human. And so when you are able to get everybody to, sit down and, really engage with whatever story you're telling, I think that creates a sort of, magical feeling to the proceedings.
It does. And I remember
that,
go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, well, it does that in a way that, I don't think video games are able to.
Oh, no, yeah, absolutely.
I think that that's really the reason why so many people focus on system. The system matters people, which I think most people in GDG would fall into.
Yeah, I would think so.
Cause we're designing our own systems. I think that that's the strongest argument they have, because if a system doesn't support that sort of, emergent storytelling possibility, at least, then it's a suboptimal system.
Yeah, I'm reminded of one of the only times I've played Dungeons and Dragons, because I've never found it to be a very appealing system. And I've watched people play it enough that I just I want a different experience out of role playing. So, but I have played it, and one of the things that I do inherently when I'm playing even something like that, our party was going through a dungeon, and it was very standard fare. It might have even been from some specific module or something like that. But like, I look for opportunities to not just role play for the sake of having a monologue in the middle of an inappropriate situation or something, but to try to interact with the environment and the logic of the situation in a way that creates a story that has nothing to do with the mechanical, you can and can't do this. It's like, and everybody else in the group, I was sort of the new player at the group, and they've been doing it for a while. Everybody else had a very standard min-max, get in, get out, sort of get the XP mentality. So, but then at the same time, I was thinking, well, how are they going to react when I do something off the cuff that clearly isn't necessary mechanically, but it's interesting. So I would like go to doors in the dungeon and I would knock on them. And everybody was laughing their ass off because it was inconceivable to them that you would not just barge in and sort of take this standard approach to it. And I'm like, no, my character wants to knock on it, see if he can hear anything, and, sort of provoke something without having to open the door. I had a logic for why I was doing it. And, in 5th edition, the DM has the option to give inspiration if something is particularly, inspiring, I guess is what the point is. And so, I got inspiration for knocking on a door. And that's sort of like, to me, that sort of proved my point when I was going in there, that it was this sort of suffocating experience of, yeah, we already know the routine. This is a game and we're all going to do our role in the party, but the potential for telling more interesting stories and having a personal touch to things was still there. And that is true probably of, the oldest OSR sort of, games. In fact, it might even be more true because when you have so little mechanically to go off of, you're forced to improvise, and that means being a little bit creative and contributing something more.
Yeah, I really think that, so you said you played 5th edition?
Yeah.
Have you, out of curiosity, have you played Pathfinder? Or,
no, I don't even know anybody that plays Pathfinder, so I've never had that opportunity.
It's very strange. In the area that I live in, Pathfinder is almost the only thing that anybody plays. So, and, none of my, current circle of friends have played anything really besides Pathfinder.
And as the guy that always GMs, I imagine that's why, you've got so many opinions about, the ins and outs of what the system encourages, right?
Right. So I'm trying to, I just recently joined this, sort of friend group. So I'm trying to currently wean them off of, Pathfinder and introduce them to other systems that, maybe allow them to do things that they haven't thought about before.
I'm wondering if you've ever considered, you're making a Pokémon RPG. It sounds really interesting, honestly, but do you ever want to just do the Heartbreaker, derivative sort of D&D or Pathfinder?
I've honestly never felt that inclination. I'm not really sure why. So kind of the way that I got into tabletop RPGs is, I really wanted to, ever since I found out what D&D was, I instantly knew that I wanted to play it. But growing up, my family was extremely religious. Mm-hmm. And, my mom would not let me touch D&D with a 20-foot pole. Well,
that's good. And, that way your soul didn't get corrupted by it.
Well, exactly. In retrospect, dodged a bullet. But at the time, I was very salty about it. And, so basically, my first experience playing it playing any system was me making up a system. So, because it kind of mirrors what I'm doing right now, ironically, because I played, Final Fantasy and Chrono Trigger on my DS, and I was like, alright, I'm gonna get a game going. So I basically was, my very first RPGs were games that I made up. And
you managed to have people who are actually willing to play with you and indulge this crazy idea of you designing your own?
Fortunately, I'm the oldest sibling, and I have 2 younger brothers.
Oh man, okay. So, that explains it.
They had very little choice.
I would have loved that for my older brothers to actually be creative enough to have come up with systems for me to play, because I also didn't have a lot of chances to play a lot of interesting games, and I definitely, when I got to a point where, I wanted to start designing my own, now I'm trying to rope them into playing it and stuff like that, so, and relatives and whoever you can, you have to try to get into play testing with you, but it's always like they're doing you a favor, but if you're the oldest, you kind of have that advantage.
Well, and so the other thing, they must have been like 6 and 8 when we started. So like, it was really, I was 15, I think. Let me think, does that work? Okay, yeah, so one of them so they would have been 7 and 9. So one of the advantages was that, I guess, so I was unconsciously, now that I'm thinking about it, imitating D&D, just because I was imitating stuff that itself imitated D&D.
Right.
And so I guess I got my fantasy heartbreaker out of my system at a very early age. But, I also got my shitty DMing out of my system at a very early age, so.
Yeah, bad habits.
What?
The bad habits.
Right, exactly. Like, you walk into a room, there are 3 wolves. They attack, roll initiative. And like, my brothers were so young, that's about all they could handle, but, they also don't really remember any of that stuff. So now as an adult, and one of my brothers is an adult now as well, they, were all able to engage in really good role playing.
Yeah, exactly.
So
as people get more mature.
If you need playtesters, convince your parents to have younger brothers. Really good way to do it.
Great advice.
Yeah. I think I was about to mention this as far as, I think one of the real problems that D&D has, to go back to that, and why it's kind of stifling for role playing, is that we kind of drew a line between systems that tell you how to do things and systems that tell you what to do.
Right.
And I think that the real problem with modern D&D from 3rd edition onward is that it's a system that tells you what to do, not how to do things. So this is something that was really striking to me. The actual published system was GURPS, because, it's generic, so it wasn't D&D basically. So that's basically the only thing my mom would let me buy.
Oh, okay, I see, yeah.
Yeah, so that's how I essentially got into it. It turned out that it has a lot of qualities I really admire later. But, when I finally, managed to get my hands on some D&D books, one of the things that really surprised me was that, characters have all of these powers specifically for combat, right? So if you look at like a character sheet, wizards have these spells that they can cast, but you have to cast them in a very specific way, and they only work in very specific context.
Okay, yeah.
And so I think that's why D&D almost always devolves into, not, I shouldn't say almost always, cause then like the people who, the hardcore, system doesn't matter people come out of the word work, but, the people, it has a tendency, let's say, to, spiral towards combat as the solution.
Oh, absolutely.
Because the system doesn't really support other ways of handling things.
Yeah. I mean, I've got a 5e, Dungeon Master, handbook in front of me right now, and I'm looking through the, creating adventures section, chapter 3, and sure does look like a lot of combat, Most of the thing is about creating encounters, and the encounters are are largely about combat. So it's not an illusion that most of your concerns as you're creating adventures there are geared towards combat. Obviously, you just look at the percent of the book that's about optimizing your combat statistics and gaining things you can use in combat. You can play without doing a lot of combat, and there's, popular.
But yeah, you're cutting out the meat of the system.
Yeah, you're either cutting it out or you're sort of teasing players in a way. And that's something else I don't like. Is like if you're going to make a system that's all about combat, why are you then pretending like it's also about living the daily life and having emotional, drama between, it's like personally, I have a philosophy of design where whatever your game is about, you should try to focus on that. And because I'm trying to be considerate of the player, if they came in expecting something, you should give it to them.
Right. Yeah. And so like that's kind of the big problem with a lot of D&D. Basically we'll say from 3.5 onward is that, or we can look at 4th edition. 4th edition probably was the worst about this because it explicitly realized, okay, our system already does this, so let's cut out all the illusions and just focus on that and making it really good. And they did a great job with that, but, people liked the illusions, I suppose.
Well, that's exactly it. That's one of the most fascinating things I find.
Plausible deniability.
What's that?
Having plausible deniability.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I don't respect about it is that the real appeal of the system is not explained because it's actually the disconnects and the dissonance you experience as a player where you have these adventures that, don't require you to interact with the system. It's like you could be playing freeform and it would be the same thing if you're not, because the system doesn't give you any tools to use really that are interesting. And so, but it gets all this credit for being a system that handles, personal, introspective drama and stuff like that. And it's like, no, it's really a basic system that's about combat and treasure and, loot and stuff. And it's kind of silly to even think otherwise considering its origins and how awkwardly it's evolved over time. But at the same time, when you sort of take it at face value or take it for granted that this is the system you're going to use to try to do everything, even if it's not appropriate to what the system encourages, it ends up getting all these defenders for, as if the system encourages other things. But personally, when I was approaching, trying to design my own heartbreaker kind of idea, I wanted to be more self-aware and honest about what the system really was. And
yeah, well, and I think that, I have two thoughts. Firstly, I think that I think that that's actually something that old school D&D does, is really good about is, the point of this game is getting treasure.
Yeah, I love that honesty of that.
Yeah, the whole mechanic of, gold equals experience.
Yeah.
Is beautiful. And I honestly if I ever run 5e again, I kind of want to import it to 5e.
I would love to see that.
Cause I don't think you would have to really change that much. You'd have to change the amount of, no, you actually wouldn't need to change that much. Cause the system already kind of apes a lot of old school, tendencies.
Yeah, I didn't play any of the earlier D&D editions, but I definitely heard everybody agree that it was sort of a callback to the oldest editions, but sort of integrating a lot of things that had been, introduced along the way as well. But at its core, it was trying to streamline things and sort of harken back to the original style.
Yeah, I think that the way that it did that is by cutting out basically all the rules for anything that isn't combat.
Oh, okay.
So if you look at so I've actually read old school. I haven't gotten to run it as much as I would like to. I've run it a little bit, but if you look at old school D&D, one of the things that's really interesting is that there really aren't that many rules for almost anything. There's sort of minimal rules for combat. There's probably the thing that there's the most rules for is collecting treasure.
Yeah. Wow.
Because that's what the character's goal was. The monsters were sort of incidental to it. And so 3rd edition is tried to turn D&D into a simulation, as near as I can tell.
Right.
So that's where all the rules came from. And so they codified a lot of things. And so the way that 5th edition streamlined it was by cutting out all of the rules for anything that wasn't combat. So like social rules, crafting rules, basically anything where you weren't rolling initiative, rules got cut out for that.
I guess that explains why I've seen a lot of people still preferring 3rd edition to this day.
Yeah, I do think that that's part of it. And actually, in a way, 4th edition kind of did the same thing. Except they, instead of, just cutting out the rules, they essentially tried to make better rules, which was, I think, the big mistake they made. Because, in 5th edition, the rules are very similar to 3rd edition, but very slimmed down.
Right.
So for the sort of cutting out of anything besides combat, as near as I can tell, really happened in 4th edition. And then 3rd edition took that, cut it down even.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons why I try to tell people if they're designing a role-playing game to be more self-aware and sort of avoid that fate of starting a game saying you're going to have, just some solutions to what you don't like in D&D, and then it ends up bloating into all these other things, and you end up almost recreating the same arc that they had as a company. You're like, well, now I'm going to codify all of this, and then I'm going to codify that, and then eventually you cut it all back, and it's just a combat system again. And it's good to have, as a designer, it's a very tricky, abstract thing to design a RPG, because obviously you're going to hand it off to GMs, and those GMs are going to interpret things and add their own twist on it. But that's sort of one of the common things we've talked about on this podcast so far, and that comes up in design discussions on GDG is, a lot of people come in as the GM and basically saying, what would I like to run as a GM? But in a way, you have to design on a higher level than that yet, and have a multitude of different GMs who might want to run it a different way. And if you don't have that really clear vision at the start that's very honest and structured, you're going to end up promising a lot of things and not actually delivering on them in the mechanics. Yeah.
To take the Pokemon system that I'm working on as an example. I'm not sure. I don't think it was this server. I think it was a different server, but I posted the rules that I had written up for it, and I got some blowback, rightfully, because the only rules that I had in the current edition, so to speak, of the write-up was for combat. Right? And so, which isn't really a role-playing system. It's great for recreating in the context of this, it's great for recreating a video game on tabletop, but that's not a role-playing system.
Right.
So
it's more like a board game at that point.
Yeah. So I had those rules, I just hadn't, codified them and written them down. And so to me, they seem obvious because they're kind of extensions of how I tend to run my games.
Right.
But when I post them, to random image boards or whatever, other people don't necessarily have those rules, or, they don't have those intuitions. They have different intuitions because they've played different games. So clearly communicating the expectations for how to use the system, I think is super key. And actually along those lines, I have a kind of funny anecdote. I ran a 5th edition campaign for about 2 years actually. And partly because that I was with wouldn't switch to anything else.
Yeah.
So it kind of, I think that's one of the other reasons that D&D is very easy or is very commonly used, is because there's a sort of inertia that sets in when you start using it, and it's very difficult to switch to anything else.
Yeah. I mean, why fix it if it isn't broken?
Right, yeah, because, if you start meddling with stuff, then you might not necessarily make it better, but it's very easy to make things a whole lot worse.
Yeah, and even as a group of people sitting around the table, it's like, well, we're kind of having fun with this. Why don't we just keep doing it? Like, yeah.
Right. Yeah, exactly. But, so the Dungeon Master's Guide was actually the last book that I got, because I kind of felt like I didn't need it, which turned out to be correct. But, when I was paying, before I understood how, like you said, you were looking at the Dungeon Master's book a little bit ago. They have extensive rules on how much experience everybody should get and how quickly they should get that experience.
Yeah.
By the book, you're supposed to be having 8 combats a level.
Or 8 encounters.
I'm sorry, 8 encounters a day. You know, so call it like an adventuring session, which is distinct from a playing session. So you're supposed to have 8 combats per adventuring session. And I was like, God, why are they tearing through everything so easily? Because, like, I tried, you know, having bigger hordes. I tried having bigger monsters. I tried both, and they just, like, whatever I put in front of them, they just tore apart. Like, they were freaking wood chippers.
Yeah.
And the other thing was that they were not leveling at all. Like, it took them, they were level 1 for, like, a whole month playing weekly.
What?
And it took them, like, it took us a few months to get to level 4. And, you know, we were having fun because we were role-playing and, like, you know, building the world. But I was like, you know, I'm pretty sure this is not how the system is meant to be run. Like, why are they taking so long to level? And so, I consulted the Dungeon Master's Guide, and the number they were supposed to be having was just absurd to me.
Right.
And so I started trying to follow those guidelines a little bit more.
So you had been giving them, you know, an amount that you felt just personally as somebody who had been a GM before was realistic and appropriate, because it's absurd to have so much otherwise. I was giving them combats that fit with, you know, what I felt it made sense from a story standpoint. Yeah, but what about the whole argument I've heard people say where it's not actually combat, it just has to be an encounter, and you give them experience just for, you know, talking to somebody and getting them to agree to help you or role-playing a certain thing?
I would agree with that if there were, you know, abilities or mechanics that supported that. Mm-hmm. So as it stands, so in 4th edition you got experience for, I don't remember if this was the case in 3rd edition, but in 4th edition you got experience for disarming traps. And they took that out of 5th edition.
Huh.
So, you know, or like, okay, let's take the social encounter thing, like giving experience for social encounters. That doesn't make any sense because none of the stuff that they get for leveling up helps them in social encounter.
Oh, right. Yeah, so you would expect the feedback cycle to be that you get better at something as you master it through difficult experiences, but you don't get better at social encounters.
Right, so your ability to overcome a social encounter is exactly the same at level 20 as it is at level 1.
Except that, presumably your bonuses to certain rolls, I mean, you can...
Well, okay, I guess I should qualify that, you know, so like you'll probably get better skills as your proficiency bonus improves, and you will, you know, like in the context of the game, your character will gain, you know, repute and renown.
Right.
So like, but none of those things, I suppose the proficiency bonus is a slight counter to what I'm saying.
But it's a very dull and almost arbitrary feeling thing.
Right. And it's, you know, compare that to like a thief's sneak attack, right? So like, that's a very interesting thing that scales as they level up.
Yeah, or like the barbarian's rage or something.
You need to have, like, there needs to be, and I think this is the big thing, it's context dependent.
Yeah.
So anytime you have to do very specific things in order to be able, like there has to be a specific situation to be able to use a sneak attack. In order to use your social roll, or, you know, your diplomacy roll, the only, like, there's basically no prerequisite. Any situation where you are doing a social, you know, where you're trying to be diplomatic, you roll diplomacy.
Yeah, there's so many opportunities. This is one of the reasons why I got so frustrated initially, and I wanted to make my own Heartbreaker, was because the times when something became relevant, and the effective player who knows these systems inside and out, he knows how to abuse them, essentially doing the diplomancy sort of route, and having an answer all the time because he just knows he can say he wants to do something, roll a dice, and there's a certain % chance he'll succeed at it. It was such a baffling oversight, I thought, in the design of the system to not have at least guidelines for saying when it's appropriate, when it's not, and not encouraging enough through the system a robust social encounter system. If you are going to claim that this system handles both combat and social things and all of these other things, how about giving us some mechanics?
I was going to say, it's not just combat and social encounters. If you open up one of the first pages in the DMG is about how there are these 7 pillars of gameplay.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Yeah. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I have seen that before. I'm going to try to find it again here.
Yeah. I don't have my books to hand. But they talk about how there's players who like exploration and social encounters and combat and puzzle solving. And, there's not but there isn't any support for those things. Mm-hmm. I think it's not just, that there's not mechanics for it, but that there's no guidelines for how the players should interact with those things in the context of the world.
Yeah.
I think that I don't remember what we were talking about, but something you mentioned earlier in the podcast, I think nails it. There's nothing to force the players to, actually engage with and pay attention to, I suppose there's no mechanical reward for players maintaining, I guess an awareness of the context of things going on in the game world.
Yeah, it feels divorced.
It's 100% up to the DM.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and yet people, as long as they can, that's sort of one of the things I find aggravating about the discussion around D&D, of course, is that the accumulated wisdom, and we've talked about this on a previous podcast, but the accumulated wisdom of all these GMs who have run what essentially are bad systems that are disconnected in many ways and have evolved in these sort of awkward ways to be a jack of all trades, even though they were really only supposed to be about one thing initially, that kind of stuff, is that GMs learn how to make bad systems fun. And that becomes the wisdom that gets passed on. If you're a good GM, you essentially know how to squeeze, blood out of a stone. It's like this, it's not designed to do this, but if you're good enough, you can make it interesting to be a social person in D&D, for example.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely agree with that.
And as a system designer, I have, I have a lot of respect for people who put up with that, but I want to make it my mission to be the best friend of the GM and, do as much as I can to help them, whether it's with guidelines or whether it's with optional rules or with its, just core mechanics or whatever. Try to help them actually easily facilitate these different goals that you would have as a GM, these different kinds of adventures, the different aspects of adventures, not just have, one sort of gimmick or thing that a mechanic system that I'm proud of. And there you go. Now, use your vast knowledge of how to GM to make this fun, but, create a bridge for them or something.
Yeah. And I think that's a really good point. And kind of having that human knowledge of, I suppose how people will interpret things and what things you need to explicitly say and what things you don't is kind of one of the challenges of good game design.
Oh, it's a huge challenge. It's a huge challenge. And then the way you present it, the order in which you present things, the length at which you talk about something, there's a lot of simple concepts that people will ramble on about for a long time in their material, and the book becomes unwieldy and you sort of have this essay that gets written about every single topic. And there's a lot of challenges in striking the right balance, even if you have the right ideas, you have good system and a good intention of helping out people to use it, it can still be very hard just to communicate the correct amount of advice and guidelines.
Yeah, definitely. And, clearly communicating to, I guess, to players as well, not just what the system is for, but like what kind of characters they should create is also a big challenge.
Yeah, if you give them the freedom to make a lot of choices, in a sense, this is something I guess I haven't had to put it into practice yet, but I imagine you want to have a sort of mission to get people on the same page, if nothing else. Like, you don't want to tell people what kind of character they should make, obviously. Just, you want to tell them how to make a character that's appropriate for what your table is trying to achieve, or, what the system is designed to handle and not handle, I guess.
Yeah. Well, so to kind of, and I think a big part of that is, genre. So I think a big part of communicating that is genre.
Yeah.
So like, feng shui, a system I have not personally played, but I know it's for, wuxia. So like, I'm supposed to have these sort of, high-flying, over-the-top martial artist characters, right? I wouldn't try to make a baker in that.
Right. No, and
right.
That is something, that does bring me to what I said last time about my system, where I had to pick a point for my own sanity, but also for the sake of players to, kind of fess up to it, that my system is designed to, handle adventurers in an adventuring setting, going on adventures. It's not designed to have the fat merchant that, has a strange set of skills that allows him to be effective in this economy or something. It's like, if you're not physically fit and willing to go fight dangerous things, that's not what this game is about, and you should just go play something else. It's like, I had to set that limit, and so it is very explicit in saying what kind of character essentially you have to make, or you're just sort of wasting your time playing my system.
Right. Well, and I think that that's one of the other, so like, I think that that's probably, the biggest, sin that Pathfinder commits. So I'm not technically a forever GM. I'm currently a player in a Pathfinder system with one of my friends.
Mm-hmm.
And, the very first character that I ever made in Pathfinder, I came from 5th edition. That was my reference point for D&D.
Right.
I just finished running that system, and 5th edition is notable for having a pretty slimmed down character creation process. And so I sat down and I, started making my my character. The guidelines I was given were not very explicit at all from the DM. He was just like, oh yeah, just make sure that your character isn't good aligned and they're this level. I'm like, all right. So I sat down and I started looking through all the stuff, and I was just blown away by the sheer wealth of option that the system has. Like, there are so many feats
in Pathfinder.
Yeah.
Okay.
Like, there are all these feats and subclasses and alternate abilities and like races and all this stuff. And I was just blown away. So I sit down and I'm like, all right, so I'd like to make a face character who kind of, like a social interaction character.
Yeah.
Like somebody who, because it was meant to be an evil campaign, so I wanted to play somebody who, kind of, talked the cops down while everybody else was running.
Like a manipulator kind of thing.
Yeah. So I took feats that allowed me to do that, and I picked a class that would kind of let me focus on that. And when I finally started playing the campaign, I was like, wow, my character is useless. Because in picking those feats for social interaction, I basically had the opportunity cost of that was not picking things that made me effective in combat.
Yeah, exactly.
And, one of the basic assumptions in Pathfinder is that you're going to pick stuff that will make you effective in combat.
Oh, right.
So, and particularly the way that, this campaign was run is that, any sort of social interaction, it was a kind of linear story, which is not, I don't think that there's inherently a problem with that, but it makes social interaction skills not really that important, because if the player is going to accomplish something, then they accomplish it, because the story needs that to happen to progress,
Yeah. So it was just sort of this wasted character that, you were tricked into thinking that these were going to be viable options.
Right, because the system told me that they would be. And, maybe if it had been a different kind of campaign, I could have been more effective. I doubt it after having played a bit more Pathfinder. But the system the system essentially lied to me about what was worth taking.
Yeah, I hate
and
that.
I think that's really why I dislike Pathfinder and like GURPS, because in GURPS, this is actually, so like what we were talking about the system not being clear is actually a sin that GURPS commits. But GURPS is essentially a game, about, I won't say realistic people, but grounded people. Right?
Yeah,
so
kind of.
people that you could conceivably meet in real life. Which is why,
depending on the genre you're trying to recreate in there, obviously you can create aliens and robots and all sorts of stuff, but.
Right, but like that they are grounded in a certain sense of, that there's a good word for this, verisimilitude.
Yeah.
Going along with that, if you create a character who's grounded and who has a specialty, so as, focus on that specialty and you'll be very competent in it.
Right.
Finder, it gives you all of these options, and they are not equal at all, because the system has certain unspoken assumptions about how you're going to play.
Mm-hmm. I wish I had a chance to play GURPS and actually see how it worked, because I think in principle, the way it's designed is more honest. I mean, obviously the title itself, generic, universal role-playing system, and the way that they encourage you to agree on a genre and limit certain things you can even pick during character creation just based on, the genre that you're recreating, all that kind of stuff feels a lot more honest. And it's like, yeah, you will be restricted when you're making your character, and that's the point, is that we're going to give you all possible things we can think of, but you have to have self-restraint as a player and as a table to say we're not allowing superhero stuff in this World War II setting or whatever.
Right. I think you just articulated, that's another reason why it's my favorite system.
Yeah, that's something that people have to learn when they're making systems. I mean, there's nothing wrong with wanting to make a universal system that handles almost everything, including, psychological things, drama, all these sort of finer details that you wouldn't get in a combat-oriented game. But, make sure that your whole system supports it, because otherwise you're going to lure people into making a character. And one has combat specialty, one has social specialty, one has sort of climbing and acrobatic sort of stuff. And it's like, you don't actually have the payoff of all of that setup. You need to have both sides. Right.
And it actually occurred that, we talk about generic systems or universal systems, but I'm not sure, it might have been on purpose, but I think you've actually hit on a very important limitation of them, which is that we talk about generic systems and universal systems, but even within that context, you still need to specify what type. Universal systems are totally doable. Generic systems are totally doable. But even within that context, you need to specify a certain type of character that, you're going to be using.
Right.
That the system is designed.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's called power level. It's a good term for it.
Sorry, you cut out there a little bit. Power logic? Is that what you said?
Oh, power levels.
Oh, power levels. Okay.
I'm not sure that's necessarily a good term for it because, Goku and Krillin have different power levels, but they're still a similar type of character.
Right. Yeah, I wouldn't know what to make of that
that's-
term, power level. I don't know what that's getting at.
So like your system you said is adventure.
Yeah.
So for example, Fate, to pick a non-GURPS example, is it explicitly says in I think the introduction that it's focused on characters who are, high people who do big things and risks.
Yeah.
Like that kind of stuff.
High action.
GURPS, high action, high thrill, high action, stuff. GURPS is focused on realistic people, or, people who have a sort of grounded aspect to them.
Flawed and nuanced.
Right, exactly. And I haven't read or played Savage Worlds, but I'm sure it has a similar kind of expectation.
Yeah.
So, creating generic systems, I think is, very, very doable. You just have to kind of restrict yourself along that axis.
Yeah, and
which I think is kind of what you've been getting at a little bit.
Yeah, not only create, the system in a way that handles mechanically the different aspects but I always see sort of this balancing act. Like every time you create something on the one side, you have to pay it off on the other side. Otherwise, there's an imbalance of design where you have all this promise initially of things that can happen, but then when it comes to actually executing them and exploring them in the system, whether you're really simulating them based on reality or a genre convention sort of trope thing, either way, you need to have the payoff on the other side, or else it's just going to disappoint people, really. Yeah.
No argument here.
Well, I think that's about everything we wanted to talk about. We covered a lot of topics, and I'm glad that, unless you wanted to bring up something else, we do have more time to talk, but I would be willing to have you back on again when your next version is released, or you want to, get people maybe to play test it, something like that.
Yeah, I enjoyed this. Nothing else really springs to mind. That was a very wide-ranging discussion.
Yeah, it's been about 2 hours, which is great. I think we're going to wrap it up here, and we'll let the people come flood into GDG and pester you with things if they have questions or comments, or they want to try your plug-and-play Pokemon system or anything like that.
All right.
Well, then that was
good to me.
That was another great conversation this time with Syntarsus, and come on to the GDG and say hello to him on the right now what he's going by there is ASDF, so you'll type that in somewhere and see his cute little bird picture in the channel there. But
I actually changed my nickname in the channel to go along with this podcast.
Oh, okay. So now you're going to be Syntarsus in the channel as well. That'll be great.
Yep.
All right. So thank you very much for coming on. We'll have you on again somewhere down the road, and have a good one.
All right. Thank you. I'm looking forward to it.